Welcome, Dede Bartlett, a very active leader in the town of New Canaan, an author and an activist. Welcome, and thanks for being here today. We look forward to talking about all kinds of things that lead us to why we're here, which is celebrating the 19th Amendment 100 years ago. Talk to me a little bit about your early life. It sounds fascinating.
I was lucky. I was an only child, born to devoted parents, grew up in New York City, exposed to so many cultural advantages and diversity that I never even knew. It was the wind beneath my wings.
Where did you go to early school?
So I went to a little co-ed private school in New York, and then my last 2 years I went to an all-girls school, and then I went on to Vassar College. I spent my junior year in Paris, a seminal experience.
That's what I want to talk about. So you went to Vassar and you spent a semester in Paris.
I did.
Talk to me about that. What was a highlight?
Well, there were many highlights. One of which was I almost got kicked out of school because I ended up posing on the hood of a car with a bottle of wine in one hand for Esquire magazine. And I didn't think that that would be any problem at all. However, the folks back in Poughkeepsie, New York, had a conversation with my parents, and after a long, charming conversation, my mother said, "They're going to let you back in, but don't pull stunts like that again."
That's great. After graduating from Vassar, you continued living in New York City and started a career, a fascinating career. Can you take us through that?
Sure, but I was a late bloomer. And it didn't happen logically, one right after the other. I took a lot of wrong steps to figure out what I was good at and where the passion was. So I was lucky enough to fall into literally public relations. I ended up being very good at it. I made a very good career with that. I worked for a PR agency, then I went in-house to a small electronics firm that was fantastically successful. I was hired by Mobil Oil to be one of the first women executives they'd ever had. And along the way, I married the guy who's been with me now for 40 plus years. We have 2 kids, and I was very lucky, but it wasn't planned. It wasn't planned.
When you were working for companies like Mobil Oil and Philip Morris, did you have any women mentors? Were there other women that you were working with alongside? You were obviously working for men, but tell us a little bit about those experiences.
It was very, very difficult then. I was the highest ranking woman at Mobil, and I was the highest ranking woman at Philip Morris. And many women who have had similar positions to mine all over the country say, we never liked being the only women in the room. And that was hard. And I think it's one of the things that has inspired me in a lot of the career development work that I've done in colleges following my corporate career, is to help young women and give them the mentoring opportunities and the advice that I never had.
Tell me a little bit about some of the advice that you offer women now.
I help them understand how important networking is. And networking is not just simply running up to somebody at a cocktail party and having a bunch of cards printed at Staples and shoving a card into somebody's hand while you're having a drink. It's not that. It's developing a relationship that is a back and a forth, a true give and take. Even if you're a junior person, you can always provide something of value to the other person.
Was there any time during your career at those 2 giant companies where you had an aha moment and felt like you had to provide some change or bring something to the next level to support yourself as a female?
Well, that's a very interesting question. If I interpret that by meaning, were there any setbacks? Yes. I don't want to get into the long litany of Me Too, but there isn't a woman alive who went through the experiences that so many of us did in corporate America in the 80s and 90s that doesn't have at least several Me Too stories. So that's not particularly specific. But one of the things that did stand out, and that I do tell young folks about when I lecture on college campuses, is that adversity will strike. You will get fired through no fault of your own. And it's how you reinvent yourself that counts. And it's how you look deep within, you find the tools, you develop the networking opportunities, the mentorship, and you created. The very best jobs I've ever had are the ones I created myself. And those are the ones I was best at.
After some time in New York and raising your kids there to begin with, you moved to New Canaan.
Well, actually, we moved to New Canaan before we had kids.
Oh, okay.
And that was a bit of a challenge.
You had never lived in a house before.
I had never lived in a house.
I want to hear about this.
Jim and I got married, and Jim's from Colorado. I don't think they raise children in cities in Colorado.
Right.
They raise them with the wide open spaces, and that was wonderful and fine. We found a cute little Cape Cod in New Canaan that was great. We were planning to have kids. There was only a couple of problems. I didn't know how to drive. We arrived up here and I realized there are no buses and there's no deli.
And you can't hail a taxi cab,
and
really,
you can't
right?
hail a taxi. And the doorman, well, that doorman doesn't here. It's not here. So I had to learn how to drive. Some of these roads here are really rough. So that was a problem. The day we arrived, there was a power outage. I didn't know anything about power outages in houses.
Sure. And
I'd heard about the snowstorm in town and the ice storm and people cooking in fireplaces, and I thought, oh, Dede darling, you're going to have to learn a whole lot of new skills. But I did. We had our little ones. I think the toughest thing was, once again, I felt like the only woman in the room. There were very few working moms on the commuter trains in the morning. But there were 4 of us out of all those guys. So we became friends. Actually, our kids were at the same preschool. So we had sort of a bond, and that was helpful. It wasn't until I took early retirement and returned to full life here in New Canaan that I met some fabulous women, developed all those women friends that I had never had while my kids were little and I was working these crazy hours and trying to figure out how I could sleep for 5 hours and raise kids and be on the train.
Was there one particular feature of New Canaan that really settled, made you decide that this is the place for us?
Sure. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. The schools were great. The community was lovely. I learned to garden. I loved that. I had my little kids out there when they were in their snowsuits sometimes when we'd have an early frost picking basil so we could freeze it in the freezer for pesto. There were so many aspects that I'd loved. I'd gone to a girls' camp in northern Connecticut. So a lot of Connecticut was really familiar to me, and I loved that. This is a beautiful, beautiful place.
When you look back on your early times in New Canaan, can you tell us a little story about just getting acclimated to being out here?
Well, I think the driving lesson probably does the most. My husband decided he was going to try to teach me how to drive. And so, of course, he'd been driving since he was 14 years old. I get behind the wheel of this monster ancient car that we'd purchased for $500 somewhere in the depths of the Queens Boulevard in New York. And I'm driving this thing, you know, like the little old lady on the edge of her seat, like that, barely covering the dashboard. And Jim takes me at the beginning of Canoe Hill. I don't know anything about Canoe Hill Road. I'd have never been on there. And we're driving along and he said, "You better turn right." He said, "You better keep on turning right." I am now petrified because Canoe Hill is basically a cow path. It's a deer path. The Indians must have used it years and centuries ago. I stopped the car, got out, had him drive, and the next day I called up the driving school here in town that still exists and said, sign me up.
That's a great story.
Yes.
Great story. When did you become so active in New Canaan? You're involved in so many different organizations, and really such a huge force in the community. Tell us about some of those programs you're involved in.
As I said, I became involved after I left the corporate world, and I always said to my kids, if there's something you don't like, you have no right to fuss about it unless you're willing to work at it. Mm-hmm. And so this was a golden opportunity. I had developed a lot of domestic violence awareness and help programs at Philip Morris when I was Vice President of Corporate Affairs Programs. My friend Judy Neville was then First Selectman, and she and I had actually ridden the train together a number of times when she was at Chase. And she said, why don't you come on and help start a help and awareness program here in New Canaan.
Quite a team, I'd say.
Yeah, that was pretty good. That was pretty good. So we began this literally in my house the week after my daughter was married in the spring of '03.
Wow.
And in the 17 years since the partnership has been really active, we've developed a lot of programs. We've worked with all the groups here in town to raise awareness about the issue, to get folks help, because this is our mission. One of the things I'm proudest about is when we first started, people in New Canaan thought this dreadful problem, which affects, frankly, 1 in 4 women in the United States and 1 in 7 men. People do not realize that. They thought this happened to other people in other towns. It took not very long until we helped get the New Canaan police trained in responding to partner violence crimes and in spreading the word. Suddenly the rates of reporting started to soar.
Wow.
My husband kept saying, who are these people who are calling? Who are they calling? I said, they're calling for help, because up until now, they haven't known where to call for help. So we were instrumental in providing help and awareness to folks who needed it. In the 17 years that the partnership has been active and working hard, more than 1,000 people in our little town of 20,000 have called the police. And that doesn't include the hundreds of other people who've called the Domestic Violence Crisis Center in Stamford and Connecticut. Mm-hmm. So we've really made inroads. We've had programs in the high schools, in the middle schools. I think one of the programs I'm happiest about was one we started several years ago that the high school is now doing, which is getting seniors, rising freshmen in college ready for the very different experience that they will find on a college campus.
Sure.
And so that's been very helpful. We want to give people tools. We want to get people help, because these are real issues. Cyber texting is real. Mm-hmm. Bullying is real. Physical abuse is real. Financial coercion is real. The town saw this again when the tragic case of Jennifer Dulos. If it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. And that served to reinforce the fact that even in this beautiful place, the world is ever with us.
Mm-hmm. You were the president of the Women's Forum of New York. Yeah. What is that?
Women's Forum of New York is an exceptional organization of women leaders in business and philanthropy and the arts. It was founded in New York in 1974. It has branches all across the United States and around the world, and there are now 7,500 women. And it's sort of 1 degree of separation from Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton and a lot of other remarkable, wonderful people.
As a leader, you have exposure to a lot of other leaders. Mm-hmm. What are some of the characteristics that make a great leader and a female leader? Well,
I think leaders have to have vision. And I don't put a gender on this because I think it is the same. They have to have a vision of where things can go, where things can be better. And I think that when I learned about domestic violence, when prosecutors and lawyers and social workers told me about domestic violence, I did not know what partner violence was. But then we saw O.J. Simpson. So my eyes were opened, and I had a vision of what life could be here in New Canaan if we got people aware of how much better it could be, how much more help we could give neighbors and folks in need. So I think the leader has to have vision. The leader has to have discipline, be willing to go the course. This is going to be a forever battle. And leaders have that. They inspire people. People want to get on board. They want to follow. And that is important. I think women bring special skills to this. And not that men don't, but having worked in organizations that were very traditional and hierarchical and almost paternalistic, I think women bring a compassion. I think they bring an empathy. I don't want to make it sound all fuzzy-wuzzy, but it's a certain sense of listening. We tend not to interrupt as much.
I would agree with that.
And I think that those are qualities of respect that folks buy into.
What kind of advice would you give a young woman starting out in the corporate world now?
My background was so very, very different than what it takes today. I was a French major with a European history and Spanish minor, and I went on to get a graduate degree in American history. This is not exactly the prerequisites for sitting in the places where I sat at board tables. But I would tell young folks today, as I do across the country, arm yourself with the quantitative skills. I had to learn mine on the fly, and that was not good, okay? So I think that is terribly important. Get the internships, however and wherever you can, the real world ones. My internships, I was a camp counselor for 3 years. Now, fabulous. Everything I learned about human nature, I learned being a camp counselor, working with the kids and their parents. But I think there are more specific ways to get that knowledge. Okay.
How do others describe you?
Well, you know, it's interesting. My kids would say, having just spent a couple of days with them, my kids would say, energetic, very curious, they would say loving, they would say puts family first.
That's
which
good.
is
Yeah.
which is what I would hope they would say.
Mm-hmm.
Happily they do. My friends would say spirited, enthusiastic, passionate.
How do you balance everything when you're raising your kids and working and doing your volunteer projects? How do you do
Well,
that?
first of all, when I was working, I was lucky to be able to sleep 5 hours, have some time with the kids, and be on that awful commute. I think one of the extraordinarily beneficial things in the last 6 months, if there's anything good to come out of COVID, is the fact that people can work remotely.
Absolutely.
My daughter works remotely. My son works remotely. That hour and a half each day on the train was a beast. Now, I made it work for me. I helped with my kids' term papers, and I sewed labels into clothes going to camp on that train.
You weren't playing cards like
No,
some of the
I wasn't
guys?
playing cards. I didn't have that luxury. I didn't have a wife at home.
Exactly.
So, but I think that in terms of quality of life with a family, working remotely is hugely important, and people will demand that going forward. Mm-hmm. That is going to be one of the non-negotiables for folks returning to the workplace.
One of the reasons we're here today is to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment being ratified,
Right.
giving the women the opportunity to vote. Tell me a little bit about how you feel about that. Would you have been involved back in the day if you were around then? And when was the first time you voted?
Well, let me unpack some of that. Yes, and yes. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was very much involved in the fight for the vote, and it was a fight. We talk about nice words like struggle. I don't think it begins to have the emotional weight that fight does. Folks don't give up power easily, and the folks who had the power weren't giving it up. Okay, so my grandmother was a Methodist minister's wife in some very conservative towns in southern Maryland and in southern Delaware. And she joined something called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WCTU was one of the great organizations in the country that was championing women's suffrage, women's emancipation. She was very active, and because it was under the umbrella of, quote, Christianity, it was appealing in these southern conservative towns. But she fought tooth and nail for that. She didn't live very long. Her health was poor, but she lived to see the passage of the 19th Amendment. Moving forward to the next generation, my mother worked from the time she was 17 years old because my grandfather refused to send her to college, even though she had received the highest grades ever recorded in the state of Delaware. So she started working 4 months before the stock market crash in '29. She rose through the secretarial ranks, saving her money, and she ended up working for an absolutely dreadful human being who was the head of the local insurance company in Wilmington, Delaware. And he got so angry with her one day, and he said, "If you were a man, Miss Jones, I'd hit you." And she said, "And Mr. Huber, if I were a man, I'd fire you."
That's amazing.
So I come from that kind of stock where it was be very clear as to what you want, know that this was fought for in a hard way. When I had the opportunity to vote for the first time, I thought, well, my gosh, this is going to be very simple. You register, you vote, and so forth. Not so fast. This is New York City. This is the 1960s. 50 years have passed since the amendment. I had to go to the local firehouse and take a literacy test.
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Before you could actually place your ballot.
Right.
Wow.
And I was an honors graduate of Vassar.
Incredible.
So it brings home the fact that there is so much work still to be done. When they talk about creating a more perfect union, we're still working on that one.
What do you hope for, Dede? What are you looking forward to? Do you see improvement coming?
You know, I really believe in the essential goodness of folks. I'm an optimist. I also am a historian, like you are. And I see that the long arc of history is long indeed, and that there are these dips in the way, but we do ultimately get there. Things aren't as bad as they were during the 13th century plagues. We will get out of this one. Things aren't as bad for women as they were 100 years ago when there were no rights, when women couldn't control their finances, when they got married, all of their worldly assets were controlled by their husbands. If they got divorced, their children went to the husband. In my mother's Southern family, they gave each young girl as she came along a very valuable piece of jewelry, not to wear, but to hold on to in case her husband did something foolish and drank it away or spend it all. She could have something to live on for herself and her kids. We've come a long way from that.
You're working on a book, or you just submitted it to your editor. Tell me a little bit about your being an author.
I am. The author part has been a lot of fun. I've basically written a trilogy on my family. My family was from the Caribbean, from the South, and from New York. So these three lines together were quite fascinating. And the book that I have just finished is a companion to those pieces in the trilogy of the various items in our home that relate to that, and it's called The Things They Loved, Our Family History in 12 Objects.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Couple fun questions.
Yes.
You love New Canaan.
I do.
What is one of the special traditions that you like about New Canaan?
Oh, that's a lovely one. We always loved as a family the family fourth at Waveney. Always took the kids to the family fourth. That's absolutely wonderful, delightful. I don't know that there's too many places in the United States that have something like that. That is very special. I think that this town is so fortunate in its physical plant, its physical property. It is beautiful. The people who are here respect it, they love it, they want to add to it. To me, New Canaan is one of those special places where what you add only makes it better. So we've been very privileged to be here for this long, and we're privileged to be able to support New Canaan and what it's doing to help all of its people.
Dede Bartlett, thank you so much for being here. You are a fascinating woman, and I am so honored to get to talk with you today. Thank you.
Meredith, thank you. This was delightful. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.